There are moments in a woman's life when hope dies so completely that she can feel its absence like a physical wound, a hollow space beneath her ribs where faith once resided. And for Lady Eleanor Ashworth, that moment came on a rain-soaked evening in late autumn, when the man she had loved, the man she had believed, would rescue her from the slow drowning of her family's disgrace, stood before the glittering assembly of London's finest, and announced his engagement to another woman, while his cruel gaze found Eleanor's across the ballroom, his lips curved in a smile that told her he had known all along what he was doing, that every whispered promise and stolen touch had been nothing more than amusement for a wealthy lord, with no intention of binding himself to a woman whose father had gambled away their fortune. She had fled then, her slippers carrying her through the French doors and into the garden, where cold rain immediately plastered her silk gown to her trembling form. But she could not bring herself to return inside, could not face the whispers that were surely already spreading like poison through the assembly, could not endure another moment of watching Lord Marcus Fairfax accept congratulations while his new betrothed, Miss Arabella Thornwood, preened beside him with her £40,000 and her satisfaction at having secured one of the season's most sought-after gentlemen. The rain fell harder, coursing down Eleanor's cheeks and mingling with tears she refused to acknowledge, and she thought of her mother's face when she would have to relay this news, thought of her father sitting in his study with another bottle of brandy and another stack of letters from creditors he could not pay, thought of the proud Ashworth name being dragged through the mud of gambling debts and failed investments, and now this public humiliation that would ensure no respectable gentleman would ever consider her again. She had been so careful, so measured in her affection, allowing herself to believe in Marcus's courtship only after months of consistent attention, and still she had been made a fool, still she had misjudged a man's character so profoundly that she wondered if she possessed any judgment at all. The music from within reached her ears in muffled strains, a waltz that seemed to mock her solitary figure standing among the drowning roses, and Eleanor lifted her face to the dark sky and let the cold water wash away the last vestiges of the girl who had believed in love, in honor, in the fundamental goodness of the human heart. That girl had been naive, dangerously so, and Eleanor understood now that the world operated on transactions rather than sentiment, that men of fortune sought fortune in return, that a woman without dowry was merely decoration to be admired and discarded when something more profitable appeared. When she finally gathered the strength to call for her family's carriage, to wrap her ruined evening cloak around her shivering shoulders and disappear into the night, Lady Eleanor Ashworth made a silent vow to herself that she would never again mistake practical arrangement for love, never again allow hope to make her vulnerable to such devastating disappointment, never again trust her heart to anyone who had not first proven themselves worthy, through actions rather than pretty words spoken in moonlit gardens. The weeks that followed that terrible night blurred together in a haze of quiet endurance, and Eleanor discovered that heartbreak, like any wound, eventually scabbed over into something that ached rather than bled, though the scar remained tender to the touch whenever she allowed herself to remember the ballroom, the rain, the devastating curve of Marcus's smile as he destroyed her before all of London. She rose each morning before dawn, as was now necessary in a household that could no longer afford sufficient servants, and she dressed herself in gowns that had been carefully mended so many times that the original fabric had become a patchwork of repairs, invisible only to those who did not look too closely, and she arranged her chestnut hair in simple styles that required no lady's maid, and she descended the stairs of Ashworth House to begin the endless work of maintaining appearances when there was almost nothing left to maintain. Her beauty remained, though she rarely thought of it now, the kind of beauty that did not depend upon silks and jewels, but rather resided in the elegant bone structure she had inherited from her mother, in eyes the color of autumn honey that held depths of intelligence and feeling, in a graceful carriage that years of deportment lessons had rendered as natural as breathing, and in a quiet dignity that circumstances had tested but not broken. She managed the household accounts with the ruthless efficiency of a general marshalling dwindling troops, stretching every remaining penny until it screamed, dismissing servants with tearful apologies and letters of reference that she hoped might help them find positions in more prosperous homes, negotiating with tradesmen for extensions of credit that everyone knew would likely never be repaid. Her mother, Lady Catherine Ashworth, had grown thin and pale with worry, spending long hours in her sitting room with correspondence that consisted mainly of letters from creditors and awkward missives from former friends who no longer invited the Ashworths to their gatherings but had not quite summoned the courage to cut the acquaintance entirely. "I do not know how we shall manage another quarter," her mother confessed one evening, her voice trembling as she clutched Eleanor's hand. "Your father speaks of debtor's prison as though it were inevitable, and I cannot. I simply cannot bear the thought of seeing him taken away, of losing this house where we raised you, where your grandmother lived and died." Eleanor's father had retreated into shame and brandy, a man who had once commanded respect in Parliament, now reduced to hiding from visitors and avoiding his own reflection. And Eleanor did not have the heart to condemn him, even as she wished desperately that he had possessed the strength to resist the gaming tables that had consumed their fortune one devastating night at a time. She understood now, with a clarity that came from the complete evaporation of romantic illusion, that there would be no handsome gentleman arriving to save them, no inheritance from a forgotten relative, no miracle to restore what had been lost through her father's weakness and society's merciless memory of every scandal and stumble. The name Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravenswood, was spoken in London's drawing rooms the way one might speak of a storm gathering on the horizon, with a mixture of fascination and fear, with voices lowered and eyes darting to ensure no servant might carry tales back to ears that reportedly heard everything and forgot nothing. Eleanor had encountered the Duke only twice in her years navigating society's waters, and both occasions had left impressions that lingered like the chill of a shadow passing over sunlight. A man tall and broad-shouldered, with hair as black as a raven's wing, and eyes of such pale grey they seemed almost silver, cutting through crowded ballrooms with an intensity that made debutantes fall silent, mid-giggle, and caused seasoned matrons to clutch their fans a little tighter. His wealth was legendary, his estate sprawling across 3 counties, his influence in Parliament whispered to rival that of men twice his age, and yet he moved through society like a spectre, attending only those functions required by his station and departing before the dancing grew lively, never courting, never flirting, never allowing anyone close enough to glimpse whatever lay beneath that marble exterior. The gossips spoke of tragedy, as gossips always did, and the story that emerged from their collective whispers painted a portrait of devastation that Eleanor, despite her own sorrows, found genuinely horrifying. The Duke's younger sister, Lady Sophia Blackwood, had been a girl of 17 when she was seduced and ruined by a gentleman who promised marriage and delivered only disgrace, abandoning her when her condition became impossible to conceal, leaving her to face society's judgment alone while he continued his life as though he had not shattered hers entirely. Lady Sophia had taken her own life within a year, they said, though the official cause of death was listed as a fever, and the Duke had transformed from a young man of occasional smiles and genuine warmth into the cold, forbidding figure that society now regarded with such wary respect. What Eleanor had not known, what she would not learn until much later, was that the gentleman who had destroyed Lady Sophia Blackwood was none other than her own uncle, her father's younger brother, a man who had died in a drunken riding accident 5 years past, and whose sins Eleanor had never suspected, for he had always seemed merely foolish and dissolute rather than genuinely wicked. The Duke knew, however, and the Duke remembered, and the Duke had spent years watching the Ashworth family from a distance, noting every stumble, every debt, every disgrace, waiting with the patience of a predator who understood that vengeance was a dish best served when one's prey had nowhere left to run. His sister's face haunted his dreams still. Her final letter burned into his memory with words of despair that he had failed to answer quickly enough, and he had sworn upon her grave that the family who had sheltered her destroyer, who had perhaps even encouraged his rakish behavior, would one day understand the true meaning of loss and helplessness and ruin. The carriage that arrived at Ashworth House on a grey Tuesday morning bore no crest upon its lacquered doors, yet the quality of its construction and the matched black horses that drew it spoke of wealth so substantial it required no advertisement, and Eleanor, who had been attempting to balance ledgers that refused to balance in her father's neglected study, heard the commotion of its arrival and felt a strange premonition settle into her bones like the ache before a storm. She descended to find their remaining elderly butler, Jenkins, pale-faced and trembling slightly as he announced that the Duke of Ravenswood awaited them in the drawing-room, and Eleanor's mother clutched her arm with fingers gone cold, while her father emerged from his hiding place with the bewildered expression of a man who could not fathom why such a personage would deign to visit their diminished household. The Duke stood before the empty fireplace like a monument carved from shadow and stone, his dark greatcoat still bearing the faint dampness of morning mist, his silver eyes surveying the room's faded grandeur with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. And when those eyes settled upon Eleanor, she felt the weight of his attention like a physical force pressing against her chest. "I shall speak plainly," he said without preamble, his voice a low rumble that brooked no interruption, "for I understand your situation permits no luxury of time for social niceties, and I have come to offer a solution that will benefit us both, though I suspect you will find my terms surprising." Her father stammered something incoherent about honor and hospitality, but the Duke silenced him with a single raised hand and continued, as though the older man had not spoken at all, outlining with clinical precision the extent of the Ashworth debts, naming creditors Eleanor had not known existed, revealing the true depth of their ruin with a thoroughness that suggested he had made a study of their destruction. "I am prepared to settle every debt, to restore this estate to solvency, and to provide a generous annual sum for your parents' comfortable retirement," he said, and Eleanor watched her mother sway slightly at words that should have sounded like salvation but emerged from his lips with all the warmth of a legal document. "In exchange for Lady Eleanor's hand in marriage, to be conducted within a fortnight, with a settlement that will ensure her security regardless of circumstances." Eleanor heard her mother's sharp intake of breath, felt her father's confusion transform into desperate hope, but she kept her gaze fixed upon the Duke's face, searching those arctic eyes for some explanation of why one of England's wealthiest men would seek to marry a disgraced woman from a ruined family when he might have had any heiress in the kingdom. "You do not know me," she said quietly, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, "and I cannot pretend to understand what you might gain from such an arrangement, for surely you are aware that I bring nothing to a marriage but scandal and debt and a family name that society has already begun to forget." Something flickered in his expression, too quickly for her to name, and his response carried an edge that might have been anger or something darker still. "I am aware of precisely what you bring, Lady Eleanor, and I assure you I have my reasons, though they need not concern you beyond the understanding that this offer will not be repeated, and that your alternatives, as I believe you know, are considerably less pleasant than becoming a duchess." The night that followed the Duke's departure stretched before Eleanor like an endless corridor of shadows, each hour bringing new waves of doubt and desperate calculation as she paced the worn carpet of her small bedchamber and tried to discern what possible advantage a man of such wealth and standing could seek in binding himself to a woman whose family name had become synonymous with debt and disgrace. She thought of Marcus, of the way his eyes had sparkled with what she had believed was genuine affection during their courtship, of the promises whispered in moonlit gardens that had proven as substantial as morning mist, and she wondered whether all men of society viewed matrimony as nothing more than a ledger to be balanced, a transaction in which women were currency to be spent or saved, according to masculine whim. The Duke's cold proposal had stripped away any remaining illusions she might have harbored about romantic love, and yet there was something almost refreshing in his brutal honesty, for he had not pretended to adore her, had not spoken of her beauty or her accomplishments, or any of the pretty lies that suitors were expected to offer. He had simply stated his terms and awaited her answer, as though negotiating the purchase of a horse or the lease of a hunting lodge. Her mother came to her chambers at dawn, eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night of her own, and spoke with trembling voice of how they could not refuse such an offer, how the alternative was the workhouse or worse, how Eleanor's sacrifice would save them all from the final disgrace of utter destitution. And though the words were desperate and pleading, Eleanor heard beneath them the terrible truth that her parents had no other hope left in the world. Her father, when she sought him in his study, could not meet her gaze, his shame so profound that he merely nodded when she told him she would accept, his hand shaking as he reached for the brandy decanter that had become his constant companion in these dark months. Eleanor returned to her room and sat before the mirror, studying her reflection with the detachment of a woman examining a painting rather than her own face, and she made a decision that would carry her through the days and weeks, and perhaps years ahead. She would enter this marriage with her eyes fully open, expecting nothing but the security that had been promised, asking for nothing beyond the terms of their arrangement, and guarding her heart so thoroughly that no man, whether cold duke or false-hearted suitor, would ever again have the power to wound her. She wrote her acceptance in a steady hand, the words formal and precise, and when the duke's response arrived, confirming arrangements for a wedding in a fortnight's time, she read it without tears, without trembling, without any of the emotions a bride might be expected to feel. Society would whisper, she knew, would speculate wildly about what the fearsome Duke of Ravenswood could possibly want with the impoverished daughter of a ruined family. But Eleanor found she no longer cared what society thought, for society had watched Marcus humiliate her and done nothing, had whispered behind fans about her family's decline, while offering neither assistance nor genuine sympathy, and she owed that glittering, heartless world nothing at all. The wedding took place on a morning of pale grey skies in the small chapel adjoining Ashworth House. Its ancient stones witnessed to generations of family unions, though none so strange as this one, and Eleanor stood before the altar in her mother's wedding gown, hastily altered to fit her slighter frame, the ivory silk bearing the faint scent of lavender and old memories, while the Duke of Ravenswood waited with the stillness of a man carved from marble, his dark coat immaculate, his expression betraying nothing of whatever thoughts moved behind those silver eyes. The vicar's words seemed to come from a great distance as Eleanor spoke her vows in a voice that did not waver, though her hands trembled slightly when Alexander took them in his own, his grip firm and cool as he repeated the ancient promises with the same businesslike efficiency he might have employed when signing a contract, and when he placed the ring upon her finger, a band of gold set with a sapphire so deep it appeared almost black. She felt the weight of it like a shackle, even as she recognized its extraordinary beauty. There were no wedding guests beyond her parents, who sat in the front pew with expressions of mingled relief and apprehension, and a handful of the Duke's servants, who had accompanied him from Ravenswood Hall, their faces carefully blank, though Eleanor caught them exchanging glances she could not interpret. No wedding breakfast followed the ceremony, for the Duke had made it clear they would depart immediately for his estate, and Eleanor embraced her mother with fierce tenderness, memorizing the lavender scent of her hair and the trembling of her thin shoulders, while her father pressed her hand and could not speak for the tears that coursed silently down his weathered cheeks. The journey to Ravenswood Hall consumed most of the day, the Duke's magnificent carriage carrying them through countryside that grew increasingly wild and dramatic as they travelled north, rolling hills, giving way to craggy outcroppings and dense forests that pressed close against the road, and throughout those long hours Alexander sat opposite her reading correspondence, as though she were not there at all, his silence neither hostile nor companionable, but simply absolute, a wall of reserve that Eleanor did not attempt to breach. When Ravenswood Hall finally emerged from the gathering dusk, Eleanor caught her breath at the sight of it, a vast edifice of grey stone that seemed to have grown organically from the landscape, its towers and turrets silhouetted against the darkening sky like something from the Gothic novels she had loved as a girl, beautiful and forbidding in equal measure, and the servants who lined the entrance hall to greet their new mistress regarded her with expressions of cautious curiosity, as though uncertain what manner of creature their master had brought among them. Alexander escorted her through corridors hung with portraits of stern-faced ancestors to a suite of rooms that would be her own, separate from his chambers by a connecting door that he did not offer to open, and as Eleanor surveyed the elegant space with its heavy velvet curtains and massive four-poster bed, she noticed with sudden sharp attention that vases of fresh white roses adorned every surface, their sweet fragrance perfuming the air, and upon the writing desk sat a small stack of books that included, impossibly, her 3 favorite novels, titles she had mentioned to no one but her mother years ago. She turned to ask how he had known, but the Duke had already withdrawn, the soft click of the closing door his only farewell, leaving Eleanor alone with the roses and the books and the bewildering question of what kind of man troubled himself to discover a bride's preferred reading while maintaining such impenetrable coldness in every other regard. The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm of formal meals and careful courtesies. Eleanor and Alexander, moving through their shared existence like dancers who had learned the steps but not the music, each morning bringing polite inquiries about sleep and health, each evening concluding with stilted conversation over elaborate dinners that neither seemed to taste, and yet beneath this veneer of distant civility, Eleanor began to sense currents she could not name, glances that lingered a moment too long, questions about her comfort that seemed to carry weight beyond mere obligation. She threw herself into exploration of the vast estate, discovering room after room of faded grandeur, libraries thick with dust and drawing rooms where Holland covers shrouded furniture like ghosts of grander times, and it was during one such wandering that she found the gardens, or rather what had once been gardens, acres of tangled wilderness where roses had grown wild and untended, where paths had disappeared beneath encroaching brambles, where fountains stood silent and choked with fallen leaves, and something in the abandoned beauty of it called to her wounded spirit, whispered of resurrection and renewal, of things that might yet bloom if given patient care. She began working there each morning, her fine gowns exchanged for simpler dress, her pale hands growing calloused as she cleared and pruned and coaxed dormant life back toward the sun, and though she told herself it was merely something to occupy the hollow hours, she knew in her deepest heart that she was trying to prove that broken things could be made beautiful again, that neglect need not mean the end of loveliness. The servants whispered of the new duchess on her knees in the dirt, but their whispers carried notes of approval, of wonder. And old Thomas the gardener, who had tended these grounds since the previous duke's time, began appearing each day to work alongside her, sharing stories of what the gardens had been in their glory. Eleanor did not know that Alexander watched her from the windows of his study, that he stood for long minutes observing her gentle persistence, her quiet determination, her complete absorption in a task that brought her no advantage and earned her nothing but soil beneath her fingernails, and she could not see how his expression shifted as he watched, could not perceive the confusion that crossed features accustomed to certainty. At dinners, their conversations remained careful, yet Eleanor noticed that he asked more questions now, inquired about her progress in the gardens, about what she planned to plant come spring, and once she caught him studying her across the candlelit table with something in his silver eyes that was not coldness, something that made her pulse quicken before she could school her reaction into indifference. It was on a grey afternoon, while seeking a particular volume on horticulture, that Eleanor discovered the portrait, hung in a dim corner of the upper gallery where few would venture, depicting a young woman with Alexander's same dark hair and striking features, her smile gentle, and her eyes holding that particular brightness of youth that has not yet learned how cruel the world can be. And Eleanor stood before it for a long moment, recognizing in those painted features both the family resemblance and the ghost of grief that haunted her husband's guarded heart. The revelation came not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the mundane accident of a door left slightly ajar, Eleanor having sought out the library on a rain-darkened afternoon to find a particular volume on the cultivation of winter roses, her soft slippers making no sound upon the carpeted corridor as she approached what she believed to be an empty room, and it was only the sound of voices that halted her steps, the low rumble of Alexander's familiar tones, accompanied by another man's more officious murmur, and something in the quality of their exchange, some tension that vibrated in the air like a plucked string, made her pause rather than announce herself, a decision she would come to regard as both the cruelest and most necessary moment of her new life. "The Ashworth debts are fully discharged, Your Grace," the solicitor was saying, papers rustling as he spoke, "and the family's creditors have been satisfied according to your instructions, though I confess I still do not entirely comprehend the purpose of such generosity toward a house you have long despised." Alexander's laugh was a cold thing, entirely unlike the occasional warmth Eleanor had begun to detect in their evening conversations, and his voice when he replied carried an edge that cut through her growing hope like a blade through silk. "Generosity, Hartwell? You mistake the nature of my investment entirely. I did not marry Eleanor Ashworth from charity, but from the most exquisite form of justice. For her uncle destroyed my sister, seduced her with pretty lies and abandoned her to shame and death, and now I shall repay that destruction in kind, teaching the Ashworth name what it means to be used and discarded." Eleanor's hand flew to the wall to steady herself as the corridor seemed to tilt beneath her feet, her mind racing backward through every interaction, every careful courtesy, every inexplicable kindness, now revealed as moves in a game she had not known she was playing, and she heard the solicitor's uncomfortable cough before he ventured, "And is the lady to be made aware of your intentions, Your Grace?" "The lady," Alexander replied with terrible precision, "will come to understand exactly what her family has cost mine, will feel the full weight of loving where she is not loved, of hoping where there is no hope, of trusting a heart that was never truly offered, just as my sweet Catherine trusted her seducer before he cast her aside to die alone and friendless. The words struck Eleanor like physical blows, each revelation another wound layered upon the scars Marcus had already carved into her soul. And yet, even as her heart fractured anew, even as she recognized the magnitude of the deception that had shaped her marriage from its very first moment, she felt something else rising alongside the devastation, something that tasted not of despair but of the cold, clean fury of a woman who refused to be destroyed twice. And when she straightened her spine against that corridor wall, her jaw set with a determination forged in the fires of betrayal, she knew that whatever else this man had planned for her, she would not crumble, would not weep, would not give him the satisfaction of witnessing her complete undoing, for she had survived Marcus Fairfax's cruelty, and she would survive this too, though the method of her survival remained yet to be determined as she turned from the door and walked with measured steps back toward her chambers, her mind already composing the confrontation that must inevitably follow. She did not allow herself the luxury of tears, did not permit the trembling that threatened her limbs to manifest in any outward sign of weakness, but instead spent the hours until dinner composing herself with the same meticulous care she had once applied to maintaining dignity in the face of her family's disgrace. And when the clock struck the hour and she descended the great staircase, her spine was straight as a blade, and her expression betrayed nothing of the tempest that raged within her breast, for she had determined that if Alexander Blackwood wished to witness her destruction, he would find himself sorely disappointed by the woman he had so gravely underestimated. She did not go to the dining room, but instead made her way directly to his study, that sanctum of masculine authority where he conducted his affairs and plotted his cruelties. And she did not knock, but pushed open the heavy oak door to find him standing at the window, his tall form silhouetted against the dying light of day. And when he turned at the sound of her entrance, she saw something flicker across his features that might have been surprise, before the familiar mask of cold composure settled back into place. "I would have the truth from your own lips," Eleanor said, and her voice emerged steady and clear, carrying none of the devastation that had so recently threatened to consume her. "For I find myself curious whether you possess the courage to speak your intentions directly to my face, or whether you prefer to confine such honesty to conversations with solicitors behind doors you believe to be closed." Alexander's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he simply regarded her, those silver eyes searching her face as though seeking something he could not name, before he exhaled slowly and moved to the fireplace, resting one hand upon the mantel as he spoke. "You were listening," he said, and it was not a question, and when Eleanor merely waited in pointed silence, he continued with a weariness that seemed at odds with the cruelty of his scheme. "Very well, then you shall have your truth, unvarnished and complete, for I did indeed marry you as an instrument of vengeance against your family, intended to make you love me, only to cast you aside as your uncle cast aside my sister, to teach the Ashworth name what it means to suffer the particular agony of betrayed trust." Eleanor absorbed the confirmation of her worst fears with a stillness that seemed to unsettle him, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the quiet dignity of a woman who had already survived one destruction and refused to submit to another. "And have you found me a satisfactory victim for your retribution, your grace? Have I proven sufficiently pitiful, sufficiently easy to manipulate, sufficiently like the monster you imagined my uncle to be?" His hand upon the mantel tightened until his knuckles showed white, and when he lifted his gaze to hers, something raw and unguarded flickered in those cold eyes. "No," he admitted, and the words seemed torn from him against his will. "You are nothing like what I expected, nothing like what I required you to be, for where I anticipated cruelty I have found only kindness, where I imagined shallow entitlement I have discovered quiet strength and dignity that puts my own behavior to shame, and I confess I no longer know what to make of you, Eleanor, or of the revenge that once seemed so righteous and now tastes of nothing but ash." Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment before she spoke the words that would define everything that followed between them. "I will not be your instrument of vengeance," she said quietly, "but neither will I flee this marriage or give you the satisfaction of my visible despair. For I made vows before God, and I intend to honor them, whatever your intentions may have been, and if you wish to destroy me, you shall have to do it while I continue to tend your gardens and grace your table, and fulfill every obligation of a duchess. For I refuse to be unmade by yet another man who views me as nothing more than a means to his own ends." She turned then, and walked from the room without waiting for his response, and though she could not see it, Alexander remained frozen before the fire for a very long time after she had gone, his carefully constructed certainties crumbling around him like the walls of a fortress built upon sand. The days that followed their confrontation took on a strange quality for Alexander, as though some fundamental axis of his world had shifted without his permission and left him perpetually off balance in a house that had always moved according to his command, and he found himself increasingly unable to focus on the correspondence that accumulated upon his desk or the estate matters that demanded his attention, his gaze drawn again and again to the window that overlooked the gardens where Eleanor worked with such quiet determination. Her slender figure bent over beds of soil. She was coaxing back to life after years of neglect, her gloved hands gentle with seedlings and ruthless with weeds, and he told himself that he watched her merely to understand his adversary, to comprehend how this woman had so thoroughly disrupted his carefully laid plans. Yet the explanation rang hollow, even within the confines of his own mind. He observed her interactions with the servants and found himself unsettled by what he witnessed, for she treated them not as fixtures of the household, but as individuals worthy of her attention and care, learning the name of every footman and housemaid, inquiring after the cook's ailing mother and the stable boy's new puppy, and he watched old Whitmore, the gardener who had served Ravenswood Hall for 40 years and who trusted no one since Catherine's death, gradually warm to the new duchess, sharing with her the secrets of the soil and the particular temperaments of roses that had bloomed for generations upon this land. And Alexander could not reconcile this gentle woman with the monster family he had constructed in his imagination during all those years of nursing his grief and rage. He made inquiries, discreet investigations into Eleanor's past and her knowledge of her uncle's sins, and what he discovered only deepened his growing disquiet, for she had been a child of 7 when her uncle had committed his betrayal, raised in a different household entirely, sheltered from the scandal that had touched her family name, and she had evidently known nothing of the man's cruelty until Alexander himself had revealed it, had spent her life innocent of the very crime for which he had condemned her, and this knowledge sat like a stone in his chest, heavy and immovable and deeply inconvenient to the narrative of righteous vengeance he had constructed. In the evenings, when they sat at opposite ends of the long dining table and engaged in conversations stripped of pretense, now that truths had been laid bare between them, he found himself studying the quiet dignity with which she comported herself, the intelligence that sparkled in her eyes when she spoke of the books she had read or the improvements she envisioned for the estate, and unbidden, unwanted, he found himself remembering Catherine at that same age, before the world had broken her, possessed of that same gentle strength, that same capacity for kindness that asked nothing in return, and the comparison struck him with the force of a physical blow, for he realized with dawning horror that in seeking to avenge his sister's destruction, he had targeted a woman who embodied everything Catherine had been before her innocence was stolen, and his revenge, which had once tasted of justice, now carried only the bitter flavor of his own cruelty, his fascination with his wife growing more dangerous with each passing day. The first time Alexander appeared in the gardens while Eleanor worked, she assumed his presence to be coincidental, a mere crossing of paths as he walked the grounds of his estate, yet when he lingered at the edge of the rose beds she was attempting to resurrect, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the soil she had been carefully amending, she found herself uncertain how to interpret this unprecedented behavior from a man who had previously confined their interactions to the formal spaces of the house and the silent tension of their evening meals. He said nothing at first, merely watched as she worked the earth with her gloved hands, and when she glanced up at him with a question in her eyes, he cleared his throat with evident discomfort and remarked that the roses had not bloomed properly in years, that Whitmore had all but given up on them, and Eleanor heard beneath his stilted observation something that might have been an offering, a tentative bridge extended across the chasm that yawned between them. And so she explained what she intended to do, the pruning and feeding and patient coaxing that might bring the neglected bushes back to their former glory, and he listened with an attention that seemed almost hungry, as though her words contained something he desperately needed to understand. The following week, workmen arrived to begin construction on a structure Eleanor had not requested, and when she inquired of the housekeeper what was being built at the far end of the garden, Mrs. Pemberton smiled with a warmth that suggested she knew more than she would say, and informed the Duchess that His Grace had commissioned a greenhouse so that her plantings might continue through the winter months, and Eleanor stood at the window watching the workers lay the foundation, her heart performing a strange and unfamiliar flutter at this evidence of consideration from a man she had every reason to despise. At dinner that evening, Alexander asked her about her childhood, not with the cold calculation of a man gathering intelligence, but with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. And Eleanor found herself speaking of summers spent at her grandmother's country house, of the elderly woman who had first taught her to love growing things, of the books she had treasured as a girl, and the dreams she had harbored. Before circumstance and heartbreak had taught her to want nothing more than security and peace, and Alexander listened with those silver eyes fixed upon her face, and occasionally he asked questions that revealed he had been paying attention, that he remembered details she had mentioned in passing days or weeks before, and Eleanor felt the walls she had so carefully constructed around her heart tremble slightly, not falling but acknowledging the presence of something that might, given time and continued evidence, convince them to lower their defenses. She did not forgive him, could not yet bring herself to trust the apparent transformation she was witnessing, but she found herself curious, despite her better judgment, wondering who Alexander Blackwood might prove to be once stripped of the armor of vengeance he had worn for so long, and that curiosity felt dangerous and thrilling and terrifying all at once. The invitation to Lord and Lady Pemberton's autumn ball arrived on a morning when the first frost had touched Eleanor's beloved gardens, and she held the cream-coloured card in hands that trembled slightly, for she had not appeared in society since her marriage had set tongues wagging across every drawing-room in London, and the prospect of facing those whispers made flesh, of enduring the curious stares and the speculation poorly hidden behind fans and gloved hands, filled her with a dread she struggled to conceal from the husband who had become something other than enemy, but not yet something she dared to name. Alexander studied her face across the breakfast table with those silver eyes that seemed to perceive far more than she wished to reveal, and he said quietly that they need not attend if she preferred to remain at Ravenswood, that society's approval meant nothing to him and should mean nothing to her. Yet Eleanor heard beneath his words an offer of protection that both touched and troubled her, for she refused to hide from the world that had witnessed her humiliation, refused to grant Marcus Fairfax or any of his ilk the satisfaction of believing her cowed by their cruelty, and so she lifted her chin and declared that the Duchess of Ravenswood would make her first public appearance, and something flickered in Alexander's gaze that might have been admiration or might have been concern, though he merely nodded and returned his attention to his correspondence. The night of the ball arrived, wrapped in autumn chill and the golden glow of countless candles, and Eleanor descended the staircase at Ravenswood Hall, wearing a gown of deep emerald silk that Alexander had commissioned from London's finest modist, though she had not asked him to do so, and he had not mentioned it until the dress arrived, and she found herself wondering again at these gestures that seemed to speak a language he could not or would not articulate in words. The ballroom at Pemberton House blazed with light and hummed with the particular energy of society assembled to observe and judge, and Eleanor felt the weight of every gaze as she entered on Alexander's arm, felt the whispers rise like wind through autumn leaves, saw the fans flutter and the heads incline toward one another as the tongue took measure of the mysterious Duke and his unexpected bride, and she kept her spine straight and her expression serene, drawing upon reserves of dignity she had cultivated through years of weathering her family's decline with grace. It was midway through the evening, as Eleanor stood near a towering arrangement of hothouse flowers and allowed herself a moment of respite from the exhausting performance of social pleasantry, that a familiar voice sent ice cascading through her veins, and she turned to find Marcus Fairfax approaching with that charming smile she had once believed spoke of love, but now recognized as the mask of a man who possessed charm in abundance and substance not at all, and on his arm walked a young woman whose expensive gown could not disguise the unhappiness that shadowed her delicate features, the heiress whose fortune Marcus had chosen over Eleanor's heart, and Eleanor understood with sudden clarity that wealth had purchased him a wife, but not the contentment he had believed would follow, and she might have felt vindication had she not been too occupied with the dread of whatever cruelty he had approached to deliver. Marcus bowed with exaggerated courtesy, and remarked upon how well marriage seemed to suit Eleanor, his tone carrying barbs poorly concealed beneath civility, and he observed that she had certainly landed upon her feet after her unfortunate circumstances, suggesting with poisonous implication that desperation must have made the fearsome Duke's offer seem like salvation rather than the peculiar arrangement society suspected it to be, and Eleanor felt Alexander's presence behind her before she saw him, felt the sudden tension that radiated from his powerful frame as he stepped to her side with an expression that made Marcus's confident smile falter. The silence that followed Marcus's poisonous words stretched for perhaps 3 heartbeats, though to Eleanor it seemed an eternity, and then Alexander moved with the fluid grace of a predator who has finally identified worthy prey, stepping forward so that his broad shoulders interposed themselves between Eleanor and the man who had once shattered her heart. And when he spoke, his voice carried with the particular clarity that commanded attention not through volume, but through the absolute authority of a man accustomed to being heard, and every conversation within earshot faltered and died as the assembled guests turned to witness what promised to be a spectacle of unprecedented proportions. "I find myself compelled to correct a misapprehension," Alexander said, his silver eyes fixed upon Marcus with an intensity that made the younger man take an involuntary step backward, "for you speak of desperation and fortune as though my wife were somehow diminished by our union, when the truth is precisely the reverse." His voice carried across the ballroom now, for the musicians had sensed the tension and allowed their playing to fade, and the silence that enveloped Pemberton House was absolute, breathless, waiting. The Duchess of Ravenswood is a woman of extraordinary intelligence, of grace that cannot be purchased regardless of the depth of one's coffers, of strength that has been tested by adversity and emerged not merely unbroken but refined, and I count myself fortunate beyond any measure. I possess the wit to calculate that she consented to become my wife." Eleanor felt the tears pressing against her eyes, hot and insistent, but she had learned long ago to master such displays, and she held them at bay through sheer force of will, as Alexander continued, his words falling like hammer blows upon the facade of Marcus's confident cruelty. "You speak of her circumstances as though poverty were a failing of character rather than accident of fate, yet I have observed that those who measure worth in coin alone are invariably those who possess nothing else of value," Alexander continued, and a ripple of reaction passed through the assembled guests, gasps imperfectly concealed behind fans and gloved hands pressed to mouths, for the Duke of Ravenswood, feared and whispered about, and never openly challenged, was publicly eviscerating one of society's golden sons, and the ton would dine upon this moment for seasons to come. "My wife required no fortune to recommend her, for her worth is evident to any observer possessed of discernment, and if you fail to recognize the treasure you held and discarded, then I can only conclude that discernment is not among your limited qualities." Marcus's face had flushed an unbecoming crimson, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound, and his unhappy bride stood frozen at his side, her expression suggesting she was witnessing confirmation of suspicions she had harbored since her wedding night, and Eleanor watched as the man who had humiliated her in a rain-soaked garden found himself diminished before the very society whose approval he had always craved, and she discovered that vindication tasted not of triumph, but of something quieter, something that felt remarkably like the first tentative stirrings of hope she had believed forever extinguished. The carriage that bore them away from Pemberton House moved through streets silvered by moonlight, and within its velvet-upholstered confines, Eleanor sat in silence that felt different from the careful distance that had characterized their earlier interactions, for something had shifted in the ballroom when Alexander had spoken those words that still echoed through her mind like the reverberations of a bell struck with unexpected force, and she found herself stealing glances at his profile as he gazed out the window, his expression unreadable in the flickering light of passing street lamps. And finally, she could contain her curiosity no longer and asked, her voice emerging smaller than she intended, why he had done it, why he had defended her with such ferocity before the very society whose opinion he claimed to disdain. And Alexander was silent for so long that she thought perhaps he would not answer at all, but then he turned to face her, and in his silver eyes she saw something she had not witnessed before, a vulnerability that seemed to cost him greatly to reveal, and he said simply that he had spoken only truth, that every word he had uttered about her worth and her grace and her strength had been nothing more than honest observation, and Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat because his voice held none of the cold calculation she had grown accustomed to hearing, none of the careful distance he had maintained since their wedding day, and she did not know what to do with this new Alexander, who looked at her as though she were something precious, rather than an instrument of revenge he had grown reluctant to wield. They returned to Ravenswood Hall to find the fire still burning in the drawing-room, and rather than retreating to their separate chambers as habit would have dictated, Eleanor found herself settling into the chair nearest the hearth, while Alexander poured brandy with hands that seemed less steady than usual, and when he pressed a glass into her fingers, their skin brushed and neither drew away. And they sat in firelight that cast dancing shadows across the walls and spoke of things they had never spoken of before, of grief that had shaped them both into creatures armored against the world, of the weight of family legacies that pressed upon shoulders too young to bear such burdens. And Alexander told her of the nights after his sister's death, when he had walked the halls of this very house, unable to sleep, for the rage that consumed him, and Eleanor told him of standing in rain-soaked gardens, with her heart shattered at her feet, and believing she would never feel anything so deeply again. And as the fire burned lower, and the brandy warmed her blood, Eleanor realized that she was no longer looking at the villain she had believed him to be when she had overheard his terrible plan, no longer seeing the cold duke who had offered marriage as transaction, but rather a man as wounded as herself, a man who had constructed walls of ice and vengeance, because the alternative was to feel the full weight of his loss, and she understood then that they were more alike than different, two souls who had learned to survive by refusing to hope, and when their eyes met across the dying flames, something passed between them that felt like the first fragile stirring of possibility. The weeks that followed the Pemberton ball brought changes so gradual that Eleanor might have failed to notice them, had she not been watching with the careful attention of a woman who had learned that survival depended upon observing what others overlooked, for Alexander began seeking her company, not merely at the dinner table where propriety demanded their interaction, but throughout the long hours of the day, appearing in the garden where she worked among her roses, with earth beneath her fingernails and contentment softening her features, settling himself upon the stone bench nearby with a book he rarely opened because his eyes wandered too frequently to where she knelt among the blooms, and in the evenings they no longer retreated to separate corners of the vast house, but found themselves gravitating toward the library, where firelight painted warmth across their features, as Alexander spoke of his sister in ways he had never permitted himself to speak before, telling Eleanor of Charlotte's infectious laughter that had once filled these halls, of her talent for watercolors and her dreams of traveling to Italy to paint the light she had read about in books, of the way she had believed so completely in the goodness of others that she had been unable to recognize villainy even when it courted her with flowers and false promises, and his voice would grow rough with grief and guilt as he confessed that he had been away at university when the scandal broke, that he had not been there to protect her, that he had returned to find her already broken beyond repair, and had channeled his anguish into a rage that had sustained him for years, but left him hollowed out and cold, and Eleanor listened with her heart aching for both the lost girl and the brother who blamed himself for a tragedy he could not have prevented, and she found herself sharing her own wounds in return, speaking of how Marcus had made her believe she was cherished when she had been merely a placeholder until a richer prospect appeared, of how his public rejection had stripped away not only her romantic illusions but her faith in her own judgment, of the nights she had lain awake wondering what deficiency in her character had made her so easy to discard, and Alexander's expression would darken with fury on her behalf, even as his hand reached across the space between them to cover hers in silent comfort, and it was during a thunderstorm that shook the ancient walls of Ravenswood Hall that Eleanor discovered she no longer flinched from his touch, but leaned into it instead, for when lightning split the sky and the crash of thunder made her gasp with involuntary alarm, Alexander's hand found hers in the darkness and held fast, his thumb tracing circles upon her palm that seemed to speak of promises neither of them was yet prepared to voice, and she did not pull away. And in the servants' quarters Mrs. Pemberton exchanged meaningful glances with the butler over their evening tea, and observed that the house felt different somehow, warmer despite the autumn chill creeping through the corridors, and the gardener who had worked these grounds for 40 years smiled knowingly when he saw the Duke carrying the Duchess's basket and leaning close to hear her opinion on where the spring bulbs should be planted, for the household could see plainly what their master and mistress had not yet found the courage to admit even to themselves, The garden that Eleanor had transformed from neglected wilderness into a sanctuary of beauty lay silver-touched beneath the autumn moon, its roses now dormant, but its structure elegant even in repose. The winding paths she had designed, leading through archways of climbing vines and past beds where spring bulbs slept beneath mulch she had laid with her own hands. And it was here that Alexander found her on an evening when the air held the crisp promise of approaching winter, and the stars scattered across the velvet sky like diamonds cast by a careless hand, and Eleanor turned at the sound of his footsteps on the gravel path, her shawl drawn close against the chill, her face luminous in the moonlight, and something in his expression made her heart stutter in her chest, for he looked as though he carried words too heavy to bear and too vital to contain any longer, and he came to stand before her in the garden she had created from chaos, this space that had become a symbol of her own restoration. And his voice, when he spoke, was rough with emotion. He had spent a lifetime learning to suppress, and he said her name as though it were a prayer or perhaps a confession, Eleanor, and she waited with breath held and pulse racing, because she could see that whatever was coming would change everything between them, irrevocably. And Alexander, this man who had married her for revenge and discovered instead something that terrified him far more than hatred ever had, began to speak in halting phrases that seemed torn from somewhere deep within his chest, telling her that he could not continue as they had been, could not pretend that his feelings remained those of a man executing a calculated plan, for the truth was that his revenge had become impossible the moment he had begun to know her, the moment her kindness had begun to illuminate the darkness he had cultivated for so long, and he confessed that he had fallen in love with her so completely that the very foundations of his carefully constructed world had crumbled, that he woke each morning with her name on his lips and retired each night with her image behind his eyes, that he watched her move through his house and his grounds and his life and felt things he had believed himself incapable of feeling, and he acknowledged that he did not deserve her forgiveness for the cruelty of his original intentions, did not deserve the grace she had shown in remaining despite knowing the truth of why he had sought her hand. But he could no longer contain what burned within him, could no longer guard against emotions that had breached every wall he had erected, and Eleanor listened with tears slipping silently down her cheeks, because his words echoed the truth she had been denying to herself for weeks, the truth that her heart had betrayed every defense she had constructed after Marcus's cruelty, had opened itself to this complicated, wounded, unexpectedly tender man despite every rational argument against such folly, and when he fell silent, his silver eyes searching her face for judgment or rejection, she stepped forward and placed her trembling hand against his chest, where his heart beat rapid and desperate beneath her palm, and she confessed in return that she loved him too, that she had fought against it with every weapon at her disposal but had lost the battle entirely, and Alexander's expression transformed from anguished uncertainty to wondering joy as he gathered her into his arms beneath the moonlit sky. Their first true embrace was nothing like the perfunctory touch of hands during their wedding ceremony, or the careful distance they had maintained through months of shared meals and stilted conversation, for when Alexander gathered Eleanor into his arms beneath the moonlit sky of the garden she had resurrected from neglect, he held her as though she were simultaneously the most precious and most fragile thing he had ever touched, his hands trembling against her back as he drew her close enough to feel the rapid flutter of her heart, matching the desperate rhythm of his own, and when his lips found hers, it was with a tenderness that made her breath catch and her knees weaken, a kiss that asked permission even as it confessed devotion, that spoke of reverence and wonder and the overwhelming terror of loving someone so completely that the very thought of loss became unbearable, and Eleanor responded with all the passion she had buried in the deepest chambers of her heart after Marcus had taught her that love was merely a weapon wielded by those who sought advantage, for she had locked away her capacity for desire along with her capacity for trust, had convinced herself that she would never again feel the sweet ache of wanting or the breathless anticipation of being wanted in return. Yet here in Alexander's arms she discovered that she had not destroyed those feelings but merely imprisoned them, and now they broke free with a force that left her gasping against his mouth as her fingers tangled in his dark hair and her body pressed against the solid warmth of his chest, and Alexander made a sound low in his throat that was half groan and half prayer as he deepened the kiss, his reserve finally shattering entirely as years of carefully cultivated coldness melted away to reveal the passionate heart he had protected behind walls of ice and vengeance. And when at last they drew apart just far enough to breathe, his forehead resting against hers and his silver eyes blazing with an intensity that made Eleanor's pulse race, he asked in a voice rough with emotion whether she would come with him, whether she would allow him to show her with more than words how completely she had transformed his world. And Eleanor answered not with speech but with action, taking his hand and allowing him to lead her through the moonlit paths of her garden and into the great house that had become her home, up the sweeping staircase and down the corridor to chambers she had never entered, his private rooms that smelled of sandalwood and leather and the indefinable essence of the man she loved, and there, in the soft glow of candlelight, they discovered each other with touches that were by turns gentle and desperate, reverent and hungry, a conversation conducted entirely through the language of hands and lips and whispered endearments. And Eleanor wept as she had not wept since her night of humiliation in the rain. But these were tears of joy and healing rather than heartbreak, tears that Alexander kissed away with murmured promises that he would spend every remaining day of his life ensuring she never had cause to weep from sorrow again. And when morning light crept through the windows, it found them intertwined in the great bed, Eleanor's head pillowed upon Alexander's chest, and his arms wrapped around her as though even in sleep he could not bear to let her go. And she lay there listening to the steady beat of his heart, and finally understood what love could be when freely given between two souls, who had chosen each other not from obligation or transaction, but from genuine recognition of their other half. The grand dinner at Ravenswood Hall that marked the turning of the season became the event that would transform society's perception of the Duke and his unexpected Duchess, for Eleanor had overseen every detail of the evening's preparations with the quiet competence that had come to characterize her reign over the great house, directing servants with gentle authority and ensuring that the flower arrangements showcased the final blooms from her beloved gardens. And as carriages began arriving in the torchlit drive and guests ascended the sweeping steps into the glittering entrance hall, whispers circulated among the assembled members of the ton about the remarkable change that had come over the fearsome Duke of Ravenswood. For those who had known him as a figure of cold calculation and barely concealed menace found themselves confronting a man transformed, his silver eyes following his wife's movements across the crowded rooms with an expression of such undisguised devotion that matrons who had once warned their daughters away from his path now sighed romantically into their champagne glasses, and Eleanor herself had blossomed into her role as Duchess with a grace that silenced even the most determined gossips, presiding over the evening's festivities with warmth and genuine charm that drew guests to her side and left them enchanted by her intelligence and kindness. Her gown of deep sapphire silk catching the candlelight as she moved through the grand rooms, she had gradually filled with life and laughter over the preceding months, and Alexander remained ever near her, his hand finding the small of her back in moments of crowded conversation, his fingers intertwining with hers when he drew her aside to steal a private word. His entire countenance softened in ways that prompted more than one observer to remark that love had accomplished what nothing else could in taming the notorious Duke. And it was into this scene of triumph and acceptance that Marcus Fairfax arrived with his wife upon his arm, the wealthy heiress whose fortune he had married, appearing as miserable as she had at every social function since their wedding, her eyes hollow and her smile fixed in the manner of one who had learned too late the price of being valued only for one's dowry. And Marcus himself surveyed the splendor of Ravenswood Hall with barely concealed envy before his gaze found Eleanor, radiant and beloved, presiding over an estate and a position that dwarfed anything his mercenary marriage had secured. And Eleanor met his eyes across the ballroom with perfect composure, feeling nothing but distant pity for the man whose cruelty had once shattered her heart. For how could his rejection wound her now, when she stood wrapped in the devotion of a man who saw her truly and loved her completely? And when Alexander appeared at her side and drew her onto the dance floor, holding her close as they waltzed beneath crystal chandeliers, Eleanor was aware of Marcus watching with bitter regret, but found she could spare him no attention, for her world had narrowed to the silver eyes gazing down at her with adoration and the strong arms guiding her through the dance, and she understood that this was her vindication made manifest, not through revenge or cruelty, but through the simple, overwhelming truth of having found a love that transformed everything it touched. 3 years had passed since that moonlit night in the garden, when two wounded souls had finally surrendered to a love neither had sought nor expected, and Ravenswood Hall had transformed so completely that visitors who had known it in its former days of shadow and silence could scarcely believe they had entered the same estate, for where once the great house had echoed with emptiness and the weight of unspoken grief, now it rang with the bright music of children's laughter and the warm bustle of a home thoroughly inhabited by joy. And Eleanor stood in the magnificent gardens that had become her legacy to the estate, watching as her son and daughter chased each other through pathways lined with roses she had planted in her first uncertain months as Duchess. The little boy of 2 years, with his father's dark hair and silver eyes, shrieking with delight as his sister, barely 4 years old and named Catherine after the aunt she would never meet, caught him around the waist and tumbled them both into the soft grass, and Eleanor felt her heart swell with a gratitude so profound it bordered on pain as she observed her children playing in sunlight that seemed to bless this place that had once known such darkness, and she did not hear Alexander approach until his arms wrapped around her from behind, and his chin came to rest upon her shoulder, his voice a low rumble of contentment, as he remarked that their son had inherited her stubbornness, while their daughter possessed her mother's talent for gentle tyranny, and Eleanor laughed and leaned back into the solid warmth of his embrace, marveling as she did each day at the transformation love had wrought in the man society had once feared, for the Duke of Ravenswood, who had arrived at her family's desperate doorstep with vengeance in his heart, had become a father who could be found crawling across nursery floors in pursuit of giggling children, who read bedtime stories in voices so dramatic the servants gathered outside the door to listen, who had wept without shame when Catherine first called him Papa, and when their son had gripped his finger with a tiny, determined fist. And Eleanor understood now that the capacity for such tenderness had always existed within him, buried beneath layers of grief and rage that had calcified around his heart like armor, and it had been her patient presence and her refusal to become the villain he had needed her to be that had slowly dissolved those defenses until the man beneath could emerge and learn to live again. And as she watched Catherine help her brother stand and brush grass from his clothes with a maternal care that reminded Eleanor achingly of Alexander's lost sister, she recognized that they had accomplished something remarkable in naming their daughter for that sweet ghost, for they had transformed tragedy into legacy and ensured that Catherine Blackwood would be remembered not only for how she had suffered, but for the love that had eventually grown from the ashes of her loss. And Alexander pressed a kiss to Eleanor's temple and murmured that he loved her with a simplicity that still made her breath catch after 3 years of hearing those words daily, and she turned in his arms to kiss him properly, while their children made sounds of theatrical disgust before dissolving into renewed laughter. And Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that this happiness was built upon foundations that would never crumble, for their love had not been born from illusion or initial passion, but had been forged through honesty and choice, and the daily decision to see each other truly and choose each other still. The evening sun descended toward the horizon in ribbons of gold and amber. As Eleanor stood at the edge of the garden she had transformed from neglected wilderness into a sanctuary of beauty and peace, her children's voices carrying on the warm summer air as Catherine led her younger brother toward the house, where their nurse waited to prepare them for bed, and Alexander's hand found hers as they stood together in the fading light, his fingers intertwining with hers in the way that had become as natural as breathing over the years of their marriage, and Eleanor found her thoughts drifting backward through time to that rain-soaked garden where she had stood alone and broken after Marcus Fairfax's cruel rejection, remembering the woman she had been, then wounded and desperate and utterly convinced that love was a fantasy she could no longer afford to believe in, and she marveled at the strange and winding path that had led her from that moment of despair to this profound contentment, for she had not found happiness through the romantic rescue she had once dreamed of as a girl, but through something far more unexpected and infinitely more precious, through two souls who had come together in circumstances of darkness and vengeance and had somehow chosen, day by day and moment by moment, to build something luminous from those shadowed beginnings. And Alexander seemed to sense the contemplative turn of her thoughts, for he drew her closer against his side and asked what occupied her mind, and Eleanor smiled and told him she was simply marveling at how thoroughly life had surprised her, for she had entered their marriage expecting nothing but cold transaction, and had discovered instead a love that had transformed not only her circumstances, but her very understanding of what the heart was capable of feeling, and Alexander's silver eyes softened in that way they always did when he looked upon her. And he confessed that he still woke some mornings unable to believe he had been granted such grace, that a man who had allowed bitterness to poison his soul had been redeemed by the steadfast love of a woman he had initially intended to destroy. And together they watched as the sun slipped below the tree line and painted the sky in shades of rose and lavender, their gardens spread before them in testament to what patient tending could accomplish, and Eleanor understood that their love was much like those gardens cultivated through attention and care, strengthened by weathering storms together, made more beautiful by each season that passed, and she leaned her head against her husband's shoulder and felt the rightness of this moment settle into her bones like warmth, knowing that the deepest and truest love often grows not from the fertile soil of easy circumstance, but from the most unexpected ground, taking root where hope seemed impossible, and flourishing precisely because it was chosen deliberately and nurtured faithfully. And so their story closes not with grand declarations, but with this quiet moment of perfect peace, two hearts that found their way through darkness into light. And to you who have journeyed with Eleanor and Alexander through despair and vengeance and the slow, miraculous blossoming of unexpected love, thank you for sharing in their tale and for believing, as they learned to believe, that love patient and love chosen can conquer even the deepest wounds and transform the most hardened heart.